The rain fell thin and stubborn that morning, as if someone unseen had been twisting an invisible string of water over the highway and refused to stop. At the edge of the road, where the flickering sign of an old diner kept blinking between life and surrender, someone was pushing a wheelchair. The wheels sliced through puddles, and the damp blanket on the young man's knees no longer gave warmth. It simply reminded him that winter was close. At the doorway, a small moment happened, the kind that rearranges the day without asking permission. An elderly woman held the door open and let not only the wheelchair inside, but also a gust of the wet, cold world outside, a contrast that made the air inside seem softer, alive. Her name was Evelyn Gray, 68 years old, a retired nurse who once believed retirement would mean sleeping past 9 and growing tomatoes on the windowsill. Life, however, had other plans. Half her savings disappeared in a failing fund, the rest in medicine for her mother, whose memories unraveled like a loose thread. When her mother passed, what remained was silence, a cracked mug, and a set of hands that still remembered how to touch weakness without turning it into shame. Since autumn, Evelyn had been working part-time at the small roadside diner, where the smell of coffee mingled with the scent of stories that no one bothered to finish. The young man in the wheelchair shivered from cold and fatigue. His hand wouldn't obey him. The spoon kept falling. His eyes searched the air for something other than pity, and Evelyn simply moved the bowl closer. She steadied his wrist the way she used to steady frightened patients decades ago, gently, firmly, as though the body were still capable of remembering comfort. She fed him slowly, with pauses that held more dignity than any words could. Every movement was precise, deliberate, respectful. Around them, noise faded. Cups stopped clinking, conversation slowed. Even the wall clock seemed to hesitate, missing every second beat before catching up again, as though it too was trying to keep rhythm with her calm. Across the road, a black car waited with its engine running. Inside sat a man who almost never waited for anything. Thomas Reed, 66, a name that lived on skyscrapers, reports, and financial headlines. From his top-floor office, every city looked the same, a mosaic of glass and distance. But these unplanned morning detours, a diner, a roadside, an unannounced pause, were the only moments that still belonged to him. The boy in the wheelchair was his son. The illness had rewritten both of their lives and left behind a quiet kind of guilt that no amount of wealth could dissolve. Thomas could fix failing companies, rebuild markets, and negotiate peace between egos, but he could not make his son's body obey gravity. Watching Evelyn now, feeding the boy with the patience of someone who had nothing left to prove, he realized that kindness had its own science, one he had never studied. When the bowl was empty, the boy relaxed. Evelyn wiped his chin with a napkin, adjusted the blanket, and let her hand rest briefly on his shoulder. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The morning light through the window did it for her. Thomas, in his car, watched the scene and memorized the pace. No grand gestures, no heroics, just a rhythm that allowed life to breathe. He didn't know yet that this quiet moment would return to him again and again, asking the same question: when did he last move this gently? That night, Evelyn walked home with her usual groceries, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, a handful of aches that didn't complain loudly anymore. Her apartment was small but orderly. On the fridge hung a note of her old medication schedule, though her own memory was sharp. She took a pill for the tremor in her fingers, lay down on the warm side of the bed, and closed her eyes on the image that refused to leave her, the young man's eyes no longer frightened, simply still. The next morning, a delivery truck stopped behind the diner. No one recognized the company name on the boxes. The new coffee machine worked without protest. The floor tiles near the sink stopped being slippery. A box of ergonomic spoons appeared in the storage room, thicker handles, softer edges. The manager shrugged, said it must have been a network upgrade. Nobody asked questions. In small places, kindness rarely leaves a return address. Evelyn only noticed that her shift felt lighter. The new tiles meant fewer chances to fall. The improved utensils made feeding easier for the few regulars who struggled with shaky hands. She smiled to herself, not because she suspected anything, but because the day had simply become less cruel. Meanwhile, miles away and floors above, Thomas Reed signed off another stack of documents. He disliked the word charity and distrusted atonement. In his notebook, such things were listed under sustainability investments. He knew systems, he believed in habits, and sometimes a habit could fix what money alone couldn't. That week, he added a few discreet notes to the company's agenda: stable supply chains for small diners, microgrants for local clinics, scholarships for caregivers who studied after long shifts. He didn't plan to tell anyone why. In his world, visible gratitude was still considered a weakness. But that night, when he tucked his son into bed, he noticed something different. The new headrest held his neck steady. His breathing was smooth, peaceful, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt that some part of him, the frozen, calculating part, was beginning to thaw.
Old age doesn't erase life, it simply changes the frame around it. The picture remains the same, but the light lands differently. Evelyn lived within this new frame without rushing. She woke at 5, opened the diner, checked receipts, arranged the morning bread so that people walking in would see not fatigue, but order. She knew every regular by name: the man in the blue jacket who always sat by the window, the woman who sorted her pills on a napkin before her coffee, the teenage boy pretending to study while watching the rain. Her small world, gathered in that diner, was a place where dignity cost nothing. When the young man in the wheelchair returned weeks later, Evelyn didn't need to think. Her hands remembered. The rhythm returned, that same steady patience that once stopped the rain. He sat a little straighter now. His chin didn't fall as often. She noticed the engraved initials on his new headrest and felt a quiet warmth, the kind that comes when you realize someone else cared enough to do things properly. Across town, a new notice appeared on the bulletin board of the local clinic: free physiotherapy hours, basic caregiver training, adaptive utensils available. The paper looked modest, as if it doubted its own importance. Yet people came. Evelyn came too, after her shift, her fingers smelling of coffee, her uniform carrying the warmth of another long day. She signed up as a volunteer for one evening each week. She didn't announce it to anyone. In her mind, where there aren't enough hands, 2 older ones are better than none. She began to teach simple things: how to hold a shoulder so the neck wouldn't ache the next day, how to find a feeding rhythm that doesn't feel like a battle, how to lift a person from bed to chair without breaking your own back. In a world that worshipped miracle pills, her lessons were about the mechanics of kindness: the right angle, the right pause, a warm napkin. People thanked her with eyes that understood more than words could say. Meanwhile, Thomas Reed was trying to dismantle his own guilt into pieces, to see where it ended and responsibility began. At 66, he knew more about structures than hearts. But for the first time, he admitted to himself that sometimes the right move wasn't upward, it was slower, smaller, grounded. He proposed a principle to his managers: Every new initiative his company funded should include a room of stillness, a physical space where someone could teach the art of slowing down enough to help another human being. His executives didn't understand. They stared as if a line of text had suddenly spoken out loud. He didn't explain further. He simply said, "Do it," and walked away. One evening in that clinic room with the slightly late clock, Evelyn met a familiar pair of eyes. Thomas stood quietly at the doorway, watching her teach a young man how to support his brother's back during a transfer. He saw no charity there, only the restoration of dignity. For the first time in decades, Thomas understood that progress wasn't always visible. Sometimes it was simply the absence of fear. He left without a word, but with the realization that his life, vast, loud, filled with figures and plans, had begun to echo something smaller, slower, truer. Evelyn finished her shift, wiped the counter, and stepped outside into the late afternoon air. The clouds were breaking apart. The same road where she'd once seen that car was now glowing with sunset. She didn't know her quiet gestures were reshaping someone's world. She only knew that life, when done gently, had a way of repeating its kindness elsewhere.
Real change rarely arrives with fanfare. It hides in the sound of a door hinge that finally stops squeaking or a window that no longer lets the cold through. The town began to change in details. By the library, a ramp appeared, not as a promise, but as a finished path to the bookshelves. In the school cafeteria, new spoons with thickened handles replaced the old ones. At the bus stop, a bench no longer slid when it rained. None of these things carried names. If a name existed somewhere, it was left unspoken, because true gratitude doesn't require engraving. Evelyn felt a new kind of tiredness in her fingers, the one that comes with colder mornings. She warmed the ointment on her palm, rubbed her wrists the way she once polished hospital rails so they wouldn't smell of antiseptic. She knew her limits now. At her age, dignity was no longer about heroism, but about bending without breaking. The young man in the wheelchair started coming to the clinic more often. The new support held his head comfortably. Pain had turned into silence, and silence into laughter. Thomas was always nearby, but never in the way. He had learned the art of standing in shadow so that light could fall on others. In the evenings, they drove home in peace, and the quiet inside the car felt like a prayer that had finally been heard. When a heavy snowstorm hit the region and electricity failed for an hour, the diner turned into a small refuge. The backup generator coughed, then settled into a rhythmic hum. Through fogged windows, the warm yellow glow looked like safety itself. Evelyn filled kettles, gathered blankets, and turned every corner into a seat for someone cold. The bus driver brought in a few extra flasks of hot water, and people came, tired, worried, holding on to each other. No one asked for names. They simply sat, breathed, and shared the same warmth. At the teenagers' table, an old deck of cards appeared, and that was enough. Outside, Thomas parked on the same spot as months before, the one where he had once watched the rain. He walked inside without his coat, carrying a box from his office's first aid kit. He didn't take off his gloves as he helped Evelyn pass small hand warmers to the guests. She nodded to him from across the room. The quiet recognition of two people who understood each other, not through words, but through rhythm. That night, they didn't exchange stories or names. They worked side by side, refilling cups, steadying hands, folding blankets. It was the kind of conversation that happens without a single sound. By morning, the storm had passed, but something else had stayed. A shared knowledge that the simplest acts can outlast the weather. Thomas returned home before dawn. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a participant, finally inside the story, not outside it.
And for a man who has spent his whole life managing outcomes, that was its own redemption. Evelyn locked the diner doors, turned off the last light, and smiled at the empty room. The table stood slightly uneven. The coffee machine clicked as it cooled, and she thought, maybe the world doesn't need to be perfect to be good. It just needs to keep being mended. One spoon, one gesture, one person at a time.
Spring arrived as if someone had finally turned off an old alarm. The town smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. At the clinic, in the same small room with the stubborn clock, a metal plaque appeared on the wall. It read simply, "Here people hold each other." The letters were small, but they glowed when the morning sun touched them. Someone had called it officially approved compassion. Evelyn had only smiled, not because the joke was funny, but because truth often hides in simple phrases. The program quietly expanded into neighboring towns. In every clinic, there was someone like Evelyn, with her own story, her own handwriting on notes, her own way of turning difficulty into routine grace. Thomas no longer feared what he had started. He created a foundation with a plain mission: to fund the small mechanics of dignity. No one measured success by tears or applause, but everyone saw the results in the small human ways: a steadier hand, a calmer meal, a shared silence that didn't hurt. Evelyn sometimes took home thin instruction booklets from the clinic. She read them at her kitchen table, glasses perched on her nose, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Her fingers still ached, but she didn't complain. Kindness, she had learned, wasn't about giving everything. It was about restoring enough strength to give again tomorrow. At night, she let herself rest earlier, proud of that quiet discipline. For once in her life, stopping felt like wisdom, not defeat. The young man in the wheelchair, now steadier, participated in a small graduation ceremony at his rehabilitation center. He lifted a modest award with both hands, not as a symbol of triumph, but as proof that endurance can be gentle. Thomas stood in the back, his face half in shadow, watching his son's smile stretch wide and easy. For years, he had seen only limitations. Now he saw peace. And peace, he realized, was its own kind of victory. That summer, the local library hosted a Slow Hands Fair, free lessons on how to feed, lift, and steady loved ones without fear. The sign above the booth read, "We'll teach you how to hold a spoon, and more than that." People walked by, smiled, and came back. Trust, it seemed, was contagious. Evelyn trained a younger volunteer, teaching her not what to do, but how to listen. She told her, "In our work, the most important thing isn't us. It's the people next to our hands." The young woman nodded, memorizing the truth the way one memorizes warmth. Across town, Thomas faced the quiet kind of challenge money can't fix: public doubt. Articles appeared claiming his foundation's compassion was just another corporate campaign. Evelyn heard about them last. Thomas read them first. He wanted to reply with facts and figures, but didn't. Instead, he asked every caregiver who had used the new rooms of stillness to write a single sentence. What changed for you? No names, no dates, just words. When the box of letters arrived, it weighed more than any annual report. Inside were phrases like, "My mother stopped fearing the night. I can feed my husband without crying. My father smiled again at dinner. I no longer fall out of my own day." Thomas placed the box on a long table in the boardroom. He said only one thing:
This isn't PR. This is the reason we exist. Evelyn faced her own quiet battle that winter. Her left hand grew weaker. One morning, she dropped her favorite cup, the one she'd carried since her nursing days. She swept the shards slowly, without anger, the way you shovel snow, knowing that clearing space makes the day lighter. That week, she let herself be replaced on 2 shifts. At the clinic, she came not as a volunteer, but as a patient. She sat, folded her hands, and let a younger woman show her how to ease the pain. To be helped didn't shame her. It completed the circle. By summer's end, a small lamp was installed beside the clinic's bench. It didn't shine in people's faces. It shone on the path ahead just enough to help them walk home safely. On the back of the bench, someone attached a new plaque that read, "Kindness doesn't need credits." No one took pictures. People had finally learned not to interrupt things that worked quietly. Evelyn often sat there for 5 minutes before her evening shift, allowing herself the discipline of stillness. In those 5 minutes, the knots of the day would loosen on their own. Thomas came less frequently, but always in those golden hours when light was long and forgiving. He'd watch Evelyn moving between tables, the way her shoulders carried years without complaint. He realized that not all mistakes in life could be repaired with money, but almost any day could be made softer. One autumn morning, he asked the foundation to name one of the new rooms of stillness after her. She found out only later, when the plaque was already on the wall. The letters read simply, "The Evelyn Gray Room." She blushed when she saw it, but didn't protest. Names, she thought, aren't for pride, they're for direction. When she retired months later, she left behind her checked napkin, a box of adaptive spoons, and a handwritten note. If you do things slowly enough, you'll always have time to do them kindly.
By autumn, the air had changed its tone. Mornings carried that soft chill that makes people stand a little straighter. Evelyn arranged her small kitchen the same way she'd arranged tables at the diner, neatly, respectfully, as if order itself were a form of gratitude. She left behind a box of adaptive spoons, her favorite checkered napkin, and a handwritten note for the next volunteer. If you move slowly enough, you'll always have time to move kindly. The town, by then, had 3 rooms of stillness and several school corners where children were taught small rules of humanity. Don't rush when someone beside you has a different pace. Don't be afraid to ask what a person needs. Don't do things for people if you can do them with them. These lessons rarely made headlines, but they changed the weather of everyday life. Thomas Reed, now 67, spoke less with numbers and more with pauses. His calendar had spaces, not empty hours, but places where he simply sat with his son, watching the same block from different sides of the street, listening to the rain tap the car roof, turning on a night lamp not to fight darkness, but to mark presence. He still ran his company, but differently. He learned that managing time is harder and far more important than managing money. In a small park where benches now stood evenly, a simple poster appeared. Tonight, stories in silence. People gathered in a circle, mostly older ones, sharing not names or dates, but quiet victories. How they learned to feed with a left hand after a stroke. How they found laughter again after losing a partner. How they stopped being ashamed of needing help. Evelyn didn't speak often. When she did, the room stilled. She spoke about the spoon, not the object itself, but the pause between movements, where dignity lives.
Somewhere near the edge of the group sat a man in a dark coat, quiet, attentive. Few knew who he was, and that was how he preferred it. In that circle, wealth and reputation dissolved. Only presence mattered. Thomas thought about that long ago rain and realized it had never really stopped. It had simply learned to fall more gently. The young man in the wheelchair now dreamed of simple things, listening to audiobooks about places he would visit through imagination, watching raindrops trace the glass, smiling when the world stayed still long enough to let him breathe. Evelyn sometimes assisted him during clinic visits. She no longer counted spoons or minutes. She counted moments when his eyes shone with calm, small victories measured in peace. Around them, the town kept mending itself quietly. A new lamp by the apartment entrance, a timer at the diner that finally kept time correctly, a bench outside the clinic that no longer wobbled. These weren't miracles, just maintenance of kindness, and perhaps that was better. At the park's exit, beneath the lamplight, someone had added another line to the plaque. Old age is not the end of the road. It's the part where you finally find company. People often pause there, straightening their backs before walking on. Maybe because the words felt like a promise, not of heroism, but of companionship. Evelyn walked home slowly, her checkered napkin folded under her arm. The air smelled faintly of rain and soap from nearby laundromats. She felt the weight of her years, but not as a burden, as proof. She had done the most important thing, passed on the rhythm of a hand that could hold weakness without making it smaller. And now that rhythm lived in others. Thomas, closing his car door across town, thought about how strange and perfect life was. The greatest investments had no accounts, no signatures, only echoes. The echo of a morning diner, of a woman feeding a stranger's son with grace, of a spoon lifted with quiet respect. He smiled knowing that some stories don't end, they simply continue in softer hands. And when the rain began again, it sounded less like sorrow and more like applause, gentle, steady, earned. Because in the end, the world had been changed not by grand gestures or names on buildings, but by a woman who once fed another woman's child with grace, and a man who learned to thank her without words. The rest was silence. And in that silence, everything finally made sense.